So, as you all know, you're here to talk about bat recording equipment. But before we get into that, a quick note on who I am. So, I've been working with bats for almost 10 years now, and I've always been extremely passionate about acoustics specifically. There's so many things that can be researched in bats, but acoustics were the thing that I really sort of fell in love with. So much that in 2019 I decided to travel around the world with a camera and a bat recorder and try to find as many species as I could in a project that I named the Big Bat Year. I ended up reaching 400 species, which is quite a lot. And then when I came back, I wondered what I wanted to do, and I decided I wanted to keep doing bat research, but also I wanted to do training. I wanted to train other people to learn bat acoustics, and I also just wanted to keep doing bat acoustics, which is why I created Barbastella Ecology, where I do all those things. And I retained the international focus that I've started with the Big Bat Year by going to Peru. And I've got projects going on in Western Asia and lots in Europe as well, with an upcoming project in Seychelles in the autumn. So we'll start with very basics. I'm sure you all know all this, but I wanted to mention it anyway. You get some extra bats on the screen as well. So what we call bat recorders are just recorders capable of recording ultrasounds. But that also means that they do record lower frequencies, which is something we would consider noise, but someone who is interested in bush crickets or small mammals might not call it noise and might actually be interested in that. But the reason I mention this is because a lot of people are surprised that bat recorders end up recording more than just bats, but that's because they're not actually bat recorders. They're ultrasonic recorders. Sorry, they're recorders capable of recording ultrasounds, but they do record everything below it. Now, there's settings you can play with to reduce that noise. We'll briefly mention them later, but you have to remember that bat recorders will record anything that sort of matches the frequency spectrum that they've been designed for. There's dozens of options out there, and they span 2 orders of magnitude. So we go from a few dozens of whatever your currency is, as long as it's okay, a few dozen euros, pounds, or dollars. If it's another country, it might be more, to a few thousands, up to 5,000-6,000 euros or US dollars. And right off the bat, well, I'll go and say that there is no perfect bat recorder. If there was, everybody would be using the same thing. The fact that there are so many options and that people use so many options is a sign that each of them has flaws and has amazing features that others don't have, which is why a workshop like this is of use to people, I think. Let's start with a quick introduction to the various technologies that are currently in use in the bat world. So it's pretty much started with heterodyne detectors. Now, those are detectors, not actually recorders, but this specific one, the Peterson D240X, is capable of recording in time expansion onto an external dictaphone or normal, so your average recorder. But a heterodyne detector is mainly designed to listen to bats in the field, not to record. The recording function was added in the higher end models, such as this one, but it has the drawback of being well, the recorder goes deaf while it expands the time of whatever you're trying to record before writing it onto the other recorder. Other options soon became available. One technology that has been fairly short-lived in the bat world is zero crossing. Now, it is still being used and it has incredible uses, There's some people doing amazing stuff with that. It's not very common. So you will quickly run into the issue of not finding people who are working with ZC. And that makes it trickier to get help on sound identification, for example. But Zero Crossing has amazing capabilities beyond just being a much smaller file, which means you can have deployments for months at a time using much smaller SD cards. It uses a lot less power, so it is a lot more convenient for longer deployments. But there are types of measurements to identify the calls that you can only do with ZC. You can't do them on the spectrograms. Then there's the most commonly used one currently. It's full spectrum. So that just records the whole thing. It records it as is. This is the, so the previous one was the Anabat Express. This one is the Wildlife Acoustics SM4. But yeah, so full spectrum files are amazing because you get to see the calls, you get to see the harmonics, you get to see everything. You get to see the differences in amplitudes, changes in amplitudes. So you get a lot more information than with Zero Crossing, but the files are a lot bigger. And so this particular device has 2 card slots, and with extended deployments, you will need those 2 card slots. And also they require a lot more power. This one takes 4 D cells, which are bulky and a bit challenging to work with sometimes. And then there's newer things that instead of having onboard processing, because the whole TAM expansion going def, ZC, and then moving to full spectrum, the main limitation was processing power. But now that our smartphones have more processing powers than computers from 40 years ago, we're actually able to do a lot more with those. And just so a lot of manufacturers are now moving to just building USB microphones that then plug into a smartphone or tablet that does all the computing. I mentioned that bat recorders are ultrasonic recorders, and usually you don't really want to record low frequencies. You don't want to hear people talking. You don't want to hear bush crickets. You really don't want those because they're horrible and they fill up your cards quickly. But you might actually be working on a project that actually does require you to use those lower frequencies, but you don't necessarily want those to be mixed with the ultrasonic recorders. So you might be in a scenario where you have to choose whether you are going for the ultrasonic version of a whether you are going for the ultrasonic recorder, an acoustic recorder, or one that is capable of both. That is a trend that is starting now with recorders that can actually, well, they can't record simultaneously, but they can switch between the two, and sort of every other recording will be ultrasonic and the other one will be acoustic. If you are surveying an area for multiple taxonomic groups, this might actually be a great solution. So this is, for example, the SM Mini. That's the acoustic version. This is the SM Mini Bat. That's the ultrasonic version. The ultrasonic version has a plug for the acoustic microphone, and then it can record both. And same with the new Anabat Chorus from Titley Scientific, which has 2 slots for 2 microphones, and then you can record both acoustic and ultrasonic recordings. I intend on using some of those in Seychelles in remote parts where any kind of data on birds, in addition to the data I'll use on bats, is going to be extremely valuable. Now, we'll go over the various types of recorders. We'll start with handheld devices, also known as active recorders. They're called active simply because you have to move your feet. What's on the right-hand side? Okay, why not? This is the relatively new Batlogger M2. So the Batlogger M is one of the most popular bat recorders out there, particularly among ecologists. And the M2 is sort of the evolution of that. So they've taken everything that people loved about the M and turn it into a device that looks nothing like the M. So the M and the M2 actually live alongside each other in the Elecon lineup. But in many ways, the M2 is still an evolution over the original M. So it retains the replaceable and repairable microphone, for example, which is something people really liked because the microphone is something that does degrade over time. Even if you take great care of your machine, the microphone will degrade over time. And having it being user replaceable is very handy because then you don't have to send it away. You can just buy a replacement microphone every X years and just without having to send it away and then potentially being without a recorder for a while. Now, for many people, it's not an issue because many people aren't recording bats in the winter, for example. So that's when you get your devices serviced. But some of us do like to have a recorder on hand at all times. It also has a screen, this one, displaying sonograms. Now, the screen is very small, so you don't get to see a lot. And from what I've seen, the onboard classifier is, well, terrible. It might have improved. I hope it has. But the results I've seen were disappointing. Then there's the Scout, a slightly cheaper but simpler unit as well. It has a screen, but it's one of those LCD with a few lines, and it's not a color screen or anything. The Elegant, the M2, it has a full color screen. It's like a tiny smartphone screen. The Scout, like the M2, has integrated GPS, so they're both great for transects, both great for just walking around a woodland to see what's there. The Scout has also a feature I find very funny because it is very, I think they know their customers. It has a back counter, so it's got a button where you can just click to add species as they emerge. Sorry, you can add bats as they emerge from building. Then there's a much cheaper option, but remember that the more you pay doesn't mean you necessarily get better sound quality, and that works both ways. So because the Pearsonic is 2 to 3 times cheaper than the Scout and the M2 doesn't mean that the sound is any worse. Actually, it's possibly even better. And it is, while the microphone isn't user replaceable, it is very easy to replace. So that is something important to bear in mind as well. With cheaper units, is usually when you cheap out on those things, one of the first thing to go is repairability, but that's not the case with the Pearsonic RPA3. In terms of features, it's quite basic, so it doesn't have GPS, doesn't have a back counter, doesn't have a proper display, but it's designed to be everything you need to record bats in the field, basically. And I have one, and I love it. It is an option that not many people know about, but it is definitely one that is worth considering. Then there's there is one extremely popular option, the Ecometer Touch, that I'm sure all of you know about. It is, so last year I ran polls on 2 different Facebook groups, and it was by far the most popular option used. I think it was close to 2/3 of the people who responded to the survey used that one. And then there's the Peterson M500 384, which produces much higher quality recordings than the Ecometer Touch. It is slightly less convenient because it doesn't just plug into your device. You need a cable, and it is also a bit tricky to use with a smartphone, mostly because the available apps are finicky. They work, but they're not as nice and easy to use as the Wildlife Acoustics app. Now, right now, I'm just presenting a few devices of various types, but in a minute, we'll go over a few things I think you should pay attention to, and then a few questions that you should ask yourselves to just. So I'm showing you what's out there, and then you can decide on your own what you need with the tools I'm going to give you. I've already talked about the SM4. So the SM4 is a passive recorder with 2 microphone slots. You can add an extension cable to mount it on a mast, for example, which is very useful. It's got 2 USB slots, 2 SD card slots, and then it's got an RJ45 jack for a GPS unit. Now, the issue with the GPS unit is that it doesn't fit in the overall unit. So it's not very handy. The GPS is definitely an afterthought, which is a bit of an issue with that one. It has been solved with the SM Mini, which you can just pair via Bluetooth with your smartphone, and then it just takes GPS data from there, which is extremely useful when you want to move your device frequently. If you are going to have a deployment of several months, it doesn't really matter that the way you include the location in your SM4. But if you are moving it every few days, you might consider first, you will need to purchase the GPS unit separately or just get something else with a built-in GPS. This is the Chorus again. Then there's the Peterson D500X. So it uses the same microphone as the M500 I showed, the USB microphone I just showed. The D500 has been around for a while, and it shows. The interface is a bit old-fashioned, and the whole unit is very heavy. It's extremely well built, but it weighs a bit. And it also, so the battery life isn't great on that one. So it definitely is a great device if you just want to record a few nights of very high quality sounds, or if you have access to a mains power supply, because in that case, you can just plug it in. And then you don't have to worry about power. But otherwise, I would tend to recommend other options instead. And then, so the backcorder family, I want to say, if you think you need a backcorder, you already know that you need one. If you don't really know what they can do, it's probably not the device for you. So they are much more expensive than other devices, but they have capabilities that no other device has. For example, this one takes a SIM card, and it can send automatic updates of sort of status updates of how full are the cards, how are the batteries, is the microphone okay? Because these are meant to be deployed on wind turbines, for example. And this sort of functionality costs a lot. It can also automatically check the microphone every day, or every time you ask it to. So they are capable of doing things that are very specialized, particularly around wind turbines, but that has a price. Then there are options that you don't just go out and buy. You have to invest some time yourself. Now, with the Audiomoth, I had a couple of workshops last month. Actually, that was 2 months ago. Wow. With the Audiomoth, you don't have to build the device yourself, but you do have to find a way to make it waterproof, which is a challenge when you have more than one and you don't want to buy the official case, which is stupidly expensive. Then investing a lot more time than just building a case, you can actually just solder one yourself. And I have done that last month with Edwin, who's on this call today. So you get all the different parts and then you have to solder them together. I had unsoldered in 15 years, and yet it went just fine. And the rest of the people attending that workshop also did great. So it is definitely not as tricky as one might think, but it might still be not something you want to do. That's fair enough. And definitely, I'd say having a group and doing this as part of a workshop really helped sort of boost my confidence that I could actually do it. Had I been on my own, just buying the parts and then putting it all together might have been a bit scarier, but hopefully we can make those workshops more common in the future, because it is a great device and it is overall very cheap. It's 150 euros, which is a lot cheaper than whatever options I showed before, for a fully capable recorder. And then there's sort of in between those two, when you want to invest a bit of time but not too much, so you don't want to solder but you are happy just fiddling a bit with the software, for example, you can assemble your own back recorder using a Raspberry Pi or similar computer, single board computer, and the USB microphones such as the Dodotronic or the M500 I mentioned earlier. And one way to do that is to go on GitHub and look up Clouded Bats, the Verb. I have one myself. It's a lot of copy and paste, so you don't have to do any of the coding yourself. But it also allows you to bring the cost of the unit down. There's no secret. If you do a part of it yourself, it is going to be cheaper because you don't have to pay for any customer service, any warranty, any assembly because you're doing it yourself. Usually it's made with parts that are built in much larger volumes than bat recorders, so that also helps bring the price down a bit. But if you just want to buy a unit and with the warranty and support that comes with it, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, I produced this graph for the Audiomoth workshop, but I thought it might actually still be relevant here because we're talking about recorders, but obviously in the whole workflow of bat sound analysis, recording is the easy bit. You just buy a device, go out. Sometimes you have to stay with the device, sometimes you don't. But either way, you have your recordings and then starts the actual bulk of the work. And the reason I wanted to mention this is because the way you're going to process all those files is going to affect, in a way, to an extent, the device that you are buying. What I mean by that is, if you buy something like an Audiomoth, you're going to have, it is very cheap, but you are going to have a lot of issues sorting through a lot of files that don't include back calls. You're going to have to deal with a lot of recordings that have poor quality calls. So the whole thing is going to take you a lot more time in the analysis than with a more expensive unit that has good quality filters on board to help you deal with those things. And well, if you are using these devices professionally, I'd say that sort of the time you're wasting is definitely better invested as money in a better device than Audiomoth. But if you are doing this just for fun, honestly, there's nothing wrong with getting an Audiomoth. I've got almost 10 now, and I love them for specific uses. They don't work for everything, but I do like them, and I do believe that they have a place in the market. So, and then even when choosing different recorders, you have to think about how you're going to use them. Are you going to go with static recorders or handheld recorders? We'll have an example later on showing the differences of things you can do with those. But obviously static recorders produce a lot more files than handheld recorders because deployment times are much longer. But how are you going to deal with all those files? Do you have a classifier? Do you have the budget for a classifier? Because none of the ones that are free are very good. The BTO acoustic pipeline, if you're lucky enough to have access to that, is free for the first 100 gigabytes. But if you've worked with static recorders, you know that that's not even a season for a single unit. So it is a budget to deal with high volumes of files, and therefore a passive recorder is an investment in a way, far beyond the price of the unit. So obviously your analysis software, now that can or cannot be a consideration. There are, for example, if you buy a Titley acoustic device, you have access to their software, and about inside, you have access to its full capabilities, as long as you are using it with Anabat produced WAV files. But it is a great software, so it is great that you are able to just use it for free. Now, if you don't use a Titley Scientific device, you have to pay for Insight. But then if you're going to pay for something, you might prefer Kaleidoscope, or you might prefer Sonobat because you don't need the file management part of Insight. There's a few questions that come from the analysis part, but that to some extent affect your decision when purchasing a recorder. And reporting also kind of influences the type of device you might want to go for, mainly because you might want to use metadata that is collected by your device. So do you need a GPS on board? Because if you don't, then you can just get away with a Pearsonic RPA3, or maybe you don't want to spend more than the Pearsonic, and then you decide to just use GPS on your phone, and then you have to merge those two sources of data in the analysis phase, which is perfectly feasible. It's what you have to do when you use a Peterson D240X, for example. So or you might want a lux meter to measure light levels, or you might want a temperature sensor because you want to associate each recording with a temperature. I did that over the winter. I used the integrated temperature sensor of the SM Mini Bat, and I have graphs showing which bats were flying at which temperature. It's a great graph to look at. Now, I'm not doing any proper science with it, but I did want to see how cold it could get before sort of the bat activity really dropped, and then what species was still flying below those temperatures. Obviously, I have only so much time today to mention all these, but I am running a course starting next week on bat sound analysis in general. So I will be covering all continents that have bats. We'll extensively cover hardware and software, as well as classifiers, sort of how to use them, which ones work best in which cases, and also how to build one, and in the considerations if you want to collect reference calls, for example. I mentioned reference material. Critical thinking, I added that because it's a big part of my course, because there's a lot of sources out there showing you tables of measurements that you can just apply to your bat calls. And okay, so if this is below X kilohertz, it's this species. But in many cases, it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's important to understand sort of what you can and cannot do with this type of information. And then there's also the possibility of just comparing with reference calls, but then there's other caveats with that. So it's basically me telling you all about the caveats of finding reliable information on how to identify bats. So those are the first four modules. The things are sort of mixed in the first four modules. The fifth module is one specifically on identification issues in Europe for European bat workers. If you want to learn more, it's batacoustics.com/academy. You are more than welcome to sign up. Okay, so as I mentioned, I ran a couple of polls. I think it was actually 2 years ago. I said 1 year ago. I think it was 2. Time flies. But I wanted to know what people were using as bat recorders, but I also wanted to know how people chose those bat recorders. And as you can see from this pie chart, now it might not be super sharp, but the large chunk, the 2/3 of the pie chart, the dark blue one, well, the darkest blue, is a recommendation from a friend or colleague. And I want to highlight this because it obviously is most likely the most common decisive factor that people use when purchasing something. But you have to understand that relying on someone's recommendation is a bit biased, because very few of us collect bat recorders. Now, there are a few of us, including me, who do that. So we have a slightly better overview of what's going on, not as good as someone who's got all of the recorders, such as a retailer, for example. And we may not have a knowledge that's as in depth about products from a specific brand as the people who work for that brand. But I think it's still important to understand that most people only buy one bat recorder. And as you'll see in a minute, I do believe that there is no bad bat recorder. And based on that statement, going with a recommendation from someone who's only used the one bat recorder, it might not be the ideal solution. So the other sources are online reviews. There are some really good reviews online. There is a really good blog that reviews detectors, but there's only one. So if you want to purchase, I don't know, let's say a graphics card, you've got dozens of reviews on YouTube, you've got dozens of articles online. So you have a lot of information to go by. It's not the case with bat recorders. You have to work with a lot less. But as you can see, the green beat at the bottom is exhibitors at conferences. So just by talking to employees, staff of manufacturers, just discussing, and you actually are convinced that this is the right tool for you, I'd say the best way to choose a recorder is to mix those colors together. So get recommendations from colleagues, ask first party, ask staff at Well Acoustics, particularly Scientific. A chat never hurts. I've had conversations with them. I wouldn't buy solely based on that, but I do believe that they have valuable information to bring to the discussion. Read online reviews. And then the blue one on the left is experience with the detector itself or the recorder. And that's, I think, what you should take away from this is that you should try to use something before buying it. So as I said, comparisons are difficult, usually because people don't own more than one recorder, and they might be comparing their opinion of their own device with someone else's opinion of their own device, but then you're adding too much opinion to the mix. Proper comparisons need also need larger sample sizes than just one device. I have one Pearsonic RPA3. I'm not going to claim that the sound quality is better than anything else I've used, because I've only tried one Pearsonic, and it might be a particularly good one, a particularly bad one. I don't think it's a bad one, but it could be, or maybe it's an average one. I have no way of knowing. There are differences. So usually the volumes are quite small. So manufacturers are still able to do a substantial amount of quality control. So there shouldn't be too many differences, but it's hard to tell. And if you can't prove that there are no differences, you kind of have to assume that there might be. So comparing one device to another one isn't necessarily a fair comparison. There's also so many variables to account for that it is, if you want to do them rigorously, it is extremely difficult and time consuming to do. Most people haven't tried enough recorders. And then you see people praising this type of menu or that type of menu, or this kind of ergonomics, or this. It's the same with cameras. You'll see discussions online about, oh, the menus by Nikon are terrible because I can't find anything. But a lot of these things are actually quite personal. So things that might work for some people may not work for others. And buying a recorder just because someone said the menus are non-intuitive isn't great, because they might be intuitive for you or they might not. You don't know until you try. And then I like reading discussions online on recommendations of bat recorders, because I like to try to figure out whether the people writing those comments actually have highlighted an actual flaw of the device, or whether they've just been using it wrong. And it does happen quite frequently. It's usually quite suspicious when someone says, "Oh, this one is bad," and then doesn't want to explain why. Because I don't think there are any bad recorders for sale on the market at the moment. The Audiomoth has probably the most issues, but I wouldn't call it bad. The other ones definitely aren't bad either. So, like I said, try before you buy. So a few things to bear in mind when you are buying. First-party information is great, but a lot of, even when you're talking to engineers in those, because those companies tend to be very small, even the engineers have had marketing training, and it shows in the way they talk about their product. Obviously, you can talk to someone who's just an engineer, and honestly, conversations with Peter Flory from Pearsonic are great because he's not trying to oversell his product. He's designed it, so he knows exactly what it can do, and it can do a lot. But he also has an incredible understanding of the industry and the electronics behind all those back recorders. So there are still many people working for various brands that you can talk to, but don't trust their word for it. Just you have to sort of cross-examine their statements with other people. Beware false economies. That's what I mentioned earlier. If you are buying a cheaper device like the Audiomoth, but then you're spending 15 more hours down the line to just figure out what is noise and what isn't, you haven't actually saved any money. Same with GPS. So you may not want to pay for an integrated GPS, but then if down the line you have to either synchronize GPS data from your phone, or what do you do if someone forgets to record the GPS data separately, but you still need it? That means you have to redo the survey. And again, it's in the commercial context here, but redoing a survey is money. Devices improve over time, but don't buy based on promises from manufacturers. So it's quite rare in this industry, but it does happen in other industries. So this is just sort of life advice, if you can take life advice from someone my age. But manufacturers love to promise things that will happen in the future. Oh, we are developing this, but you might have to wait 1 or 2 years. And one example, the reason I put it in there is because Titley Scientific, they were teasing for a while that they might offer the option to convert an Express, so the zero crossing version, into a Swift, the full spectrum version, to save money for people, and also reduce the amount of e-waste produced, because you don't have to throw away your device, you can just upgrade it. But so they've actually gone through with the program, and it is something you can do. So if you've got an Express but you'd like to have a Swift, you can just have it upgraded. But until they've sort of confirmed it, I wouldn't just go ahead and buy an Express thinking, oh, it might have to become I might be able to upgrade it to a Swift later down the line if I want to. Always just wait for confirmation. If features are going to happen in the future, maybe wait until those features actually happen. Same for classifiers. For example, should you buy the Ecometer Touch for its classifier if you're in South Africa, because Wildlife Acoustics promises that it is going to get better very soon? I don't think so, because I don't think it is going to get that much better in the next couple of years. It might be, but they're not just limited by themselves. They are also limited by the amount of reference material that they can get from the region. And there just isn't that much to build a classifier good enough for the region. So I'm not saying it will never happen. I strongly believe it will happen. I just wouldn't trust, I just wouldn't buy something based on something I'm being promised. And then also, when you're talking about, when you're talking to people about which recorder you should buy, also talk to people who've had bad experiences with their device, because usually, I mean, mistakes can happen. They can be a flaw in the design, and that can be fine, or it can't be fine. It can be a deal breaker. But usually it's how the brand will handle the issue that you will get the most information on whether it's a good idea or not to buy the particular device. If the answer from a manufacturer is to just throw it away and give you a new one, it might be very convenient, but from an environmental perspective, it's not ideal. Whereas if their philosophy is more to try to fix things, that is pretty good. It's true for any kind of electronics, to be honest. And then sort of related to that, try to discuss things, try to talk to people who've used those devices for more than a season or two. Try to see how they last over time. Maybe the brand has a reputation for dropping support after just 5 or 6 years. 5 or 6 years might sound like a lot, but if you are running a long-term project using static recorders and a very standard protocol, you can't just change recorders after 5 or 6 years, because then your data is screwed. So how long a brand keeps servicing their products is quite useful. And the fact that Titley, for example, comes in and offering an upgrade to the Express to Swift, obviously you can still keep using your Express and they can still fix your Express. But if you are wanting to sort of upgrade from I shouldn't say upgrade from zero crossing to full spectrum, but if you want to move from zero crossing to full spectrum, you can do that without having to buy a completely new device. And then repairability, I mentioned it when I presented the various recorders. Some devices are meant to be repairable, some are designed not to be repairable. There are examples on either side of the spectrum on that photo. I'll let you guess which ones. But that is, I believe, something that should still be kept in mind. Again, try before you buy. So what questions should you ask yourself when you are looking at buying a recorder? First is set a budget. You likely have a budget in mind. Try to stick to that. I think now the market is segmented enough that you should be able to find something that fits your budget. And then try to think about what features you would like. So do you need a screen? Personally, in the field, I use a screen more than I use sound, which is why I bought, my main recorder is a Animac Walkabout. Has a great screen. Sound is not great. So if you are identifying bats by sound, don't buy a Walkabout. If you are interested in identifying bat by sound, you want to buy an RPA3 or Billier 17Z bat, or I think the Edicon have pretty good sound as well. Or if you want both, then go for Edicon Batlogger M2 or something, because I mean the screen is very small, it's not great. But so these are the questions you have to ask yourself. Same for the sort of added information collected aside from the bats, I'd say. So that would be GPS data, temperature sensor, lux meter, humidity sensor. I don't know what else they're building on bat recorders now, but those things cost money, and you have to decide whether or not you need them. Do you need an acoustic microphone or do you need the possibility of adding an acoustic microphone down the line? And then that's mostly for passive recorders, but you should have a pretty good idea of how long you want to deploy your recorders for, because it goes from roughly 10 to 14 days for the SM Mini and the SM4, up to about a month, a little over a month for Swift, or with the SM Mini, with the 18650 batteries, you can sort of get close to 3 months. But those things are considerations that you need to make at the very beginning. If you are buying an SM4, for example, you will be dealing with massive, I can't remember if they're D cells or C cells, but they're big and bulky. You can get rechargeable ones, but if you are, for example, traveling to the rainforest in Peru, it might not be very practical to travel with a bag full of D-cell batteries, and you might want to go for something that uses AA batteries that you can find more readily in the rainforest. So, like I said, it might be a hot take, I don't know, but I believe that there are no bat recorders, but there are bad users who may not have read the manual or simply don't have good field practices. So it could be that they're not getting good quality recordings, but not because the recording is wrong. The recorder has a problem, but because, for example, they're using an echometer touch and they're using it right against their body, which means that the echometer will record a lot of the reverb from the user's body, turning all the calls into mush. Or you could have the same with the SM Mini Bat, for example. It doesn't have an extension cord for the microphone, so you have to put the device, the physical unit, away from any kind of surfaces. So surfaces are walls, the ground, leaves, all that, to avoid reverb. So you should always aim to have 2 meters between your microphone and surfaces, any kind of surfaces, flat or not, doesn't matter, it has to be surface. And a lot of people don't do that. Now there are suboptimal recorders. There are some recorders have issues. The Batlogger M doesn't have adjustable gain, and I've seen dozens of recordings, hundreds if not thousands of recordings of my Otis that are unusable because they're overloaded. And I haven't seen that as frequently with other recorders. I think the gain is not only not adjustable, but it's also set quite high, which is an issue, because if it was set lower, you would probably have fewer overloaded calls and it wouldn't be as big an issue. Because honestly, I don't change the gain on my recorders. It's just usually the default setting is fine. But if it were to be too high, I would probably move it, would probably switch it a bit lower. But if you can't do that, it is a problem. So when to choose an active recorder versus a passive recorder? So, I mean, it's usually straightforward, but I want to talk a bit about transects specifically, because a lot of people still use transects when they may not actually be appropriate for what they are wanting to do. So here's an example. I would gladly send you a chocolate if you can guess where this is from without Googling. So imagine you're on this island somewhere and you'd like to have an idea of what's going on. You could decide to just walk from one end to another. So these are the bats present. This is not actually a species you should expect there, but doesn't matter. Kiruvula picta is cute. So you could decide to just walk from one end to another. But as you can see, bat activity changes over time, and it takes you significant amount of time to go from A to B. And while you were traveling from A to B, activity changed without you noticing it. And in fact, the second bat from the left only started flying once you had gone past it. So you wouldn't have recorded it. A solution to that is using a static recorder, but it uses a lot more. First, you're not going to cover as much of the area, just because, I mean, unless you have very deep pockets, in which case you can just buy enough recorders to cover the whole thing. But that is going to generate a lot more data. So you have to process all that. So again, you need very deep pockets to pay people to analyze all that, which I can do, by the way, which is, I didn't mean to lead to that, but yeah, I can analyze data for you. So yes, there are things, for example, this kind of graph, you can't do that with a transect because you can never compare activity in different areas based on a transect, because you can never remove the variable of time. You will always be at different times in different places, and there will always be differences in bat activity over time without accounting for anything else. So transects are very the way people use transects is a bit dangerous because they can fail to account for natural differences over time. So this kind of analysis, which is just shows the number of recordings on the y-axis over time on the x-axis for per night. So the 0 would be midnight, and then you go before midnight or after midnight. And here we can definitely see that the site is being used by seroutines at the very end of the night. Now, what it means, I don't know in this case, but you can't do the same kind of graph for a transect because you wouldn't be in all those different places at the same time. So if what you want to do is know exactly when a site is being used by specific bat species, transects are not the thing for you. And then you have to get static recordings instead with the workflow that goes along with them. So okay, I ran over a bit, but that's fine. You're still there, so that's good. A few specific recommendations. If you're only looking at doing emergence counts, I would strongly suggest a heterodyne detector. Now you might want to get an EMT just to have a few recordings to, especially if they're commercial emergence counts, because you might have to prove the identity of the bats, in which case a recording of decent quality, which the EMT can give you for pretty cheap. For transect, the Scout, the Batlogger M2, RPA3 all have good microphones. The RPA3 doesn't have a GPS, so just bear that in mind. But if your transect is pretty much standard, or you can just have, I mean, your phone has a GPS, you can just synchronize that later on if you don't forget. If you absolutely need a screen, get a walkabout, or if you don't want to invest that much, get a Peterson USB microphone or the Ecommeter Touch. If you are getting those USB microphones, do try to put them away from your body. So that means on a pole in a backpack, for example. So try to get them a meter or more above your head. It makes it a bit awkward when you are working through a woodland because you tend to hit branches. But I can guarantee you that the quality of your recordings will be vastly superior. If you want to use a bat recorder or bat detector for outreach, to just show things to people, either get a heterodyne detector, because the sound of heterodyne, I find it a lot nicer than time expansion. And I found people to react more positively to it as well. Or get an Ecommeter Touch, and then you have it, and get it on a tablet, and then you can show the calls to people. Especially children love seeing the calls as well as hearing them. If you are looking at long deployments, using static recorders, you have a few options. You can get the Swift. If you fill it with 8 AA batteries, you can last over a month, I think up to 6 weeks, if not 8, depending on levels of bat activity and levels of bush crickets. Or you can get SM4 with solar panels. So the SM4, even though it uses massive batteries, it doesn't actually last very long. Or you could consider zero crossing. I'm not going to teach anything about zero crossing because I know very little about it. But long deployments is definitely where it shines. That and Myotis. But then if you are sampling a woodland, for example, a very large woodland, but you want to sample many different parts of it, instead of trying to find the most sensitive microphone ever made, which is going to run you thousands of dollars, you're talking about 10 grand or more, just to give you an idea. Instead of trying to find the most sensitive, just to have the most range, why not consider a protocol where you would sample various parts of it one after the other? Now, you wouldn't be able to compare activity and diversity in those different places for the same reason I mentioned about transects. But if you have, for example, a unit that has GPS capabilities with an asterisk, like the SM Mini Bat, as long as you have your phone to synchronize GPS data, it has that. But I've done that in Peru, and it was actually quite handy just to be able to move it after a couple of nights and sort of sample the whole area that way. And then if learning to solder or assembling things doesn't scare you and you have time for that, why not consider the Teensy Bat or the Clouded Bat's Werb or any of those options? Honestly, they're great fun. And if something breaks on my Teensy Bat, I can actually fix it myself because I've built it myself. So thank you very much. Like I said, I'm running a bat sound analysis course starting next week. And then I'll be running a data management course where we'll talk about backups and storing data safely and things like that later on, but details will happen at some point. You will get an email. And I also offer services of bat sound analysis and acoustic reference library compilation or recording. So that's it for me. If you have questions, I am going to stay online. If you have to leave, that's fine. I know we ran over, but I will stay as long as you need me to. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you found it interesting. Does a better, more expensive microphone mainly equate to greater range / sensitivity? Yes, to an extent. So greater range, sensitivity goes beyond greater range because sensitivity is also, it is frequency dependent. So you could have a recorder that doesn't necessarily have a better range, but it is, for example, more likely to pick up high frequency species such as horseshoe bats. That is something some recorders such as Eudemoth lack, is good response, good sensitivity to higher frequencies. It's not always going to be a more expensive microphone. Actually, most microphone, the bit itself, the part itself is usually very cheap. It's sort of it's how it's wired up and how the recorder compensates for example, any waterproofing of the microphone, things like that, that will affect the sound more than the actual microphone itself, which is usually the part itself is the same in a lot of the recorders that I talked about today. I was going to say something else, but I forgot. I'll see if I can get back to what I was thinking about. Is it possible to catch a virus on a recorder? As far as I know, none of them have an internet connection, so no. Can the EQ touch be elevated plus from 1 meter from your phone tablet to get? Yes, it works really well. So you can get, what I did was get a very long selfie stick because they're very cheap and they're very easy to break. So I broke off the end bit, which is meant to carry phone, not a microphone, and then just stick that in a small backpack and have a cable run from the microphone to the tablet or phone, and it works really well. Yeah. Very expensive to seem to have. Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, Edwin knows a lot more than me, but diminishing returns happen very quickly in acoustics. So spending a lot more money is not going to get you much better quality. Which is sort of where I wanted to get earlier, but my brain is fried. Is there a way to get a recording of today's workshop? Yes, you will get a link. So wherever you got the link to the Zoom, wherever you got the Zoom link on my website, not the announcement per email. So you connect to your account on my website, and there you will have, you've got a text post that have the Zoom link, and then you will also have from tomorrow, hopefully, a video post where you can get the video file. Yeah. So yeah, no, I remember what I was going to say about sensitivity is that chasing sensitivity is a bit of a pointless and endless quest, because first, as Edwin said, it is going to cost you a lot of money, and then usually it can be either accounted for in your protocol or just account for that and accept that you are only going to record so many bats in the sphere around your microphone. You always have to remember that range isn't in 2 dimensions, it's in 3 dimensions. So it is always going to be a sphere, and there will always be bats outside of that sphere. That doesn't mean you should get the cheapest microphone you can get because you don't care how many bats are beyond that sphere. But I think designing your study in order to have that sphere or those spheres cover as much of your study area as possible is more meaningful than just chasing the most sensitive microphone. Any tangible gains to be made through attaching an external microphone to an audio mouth? Yes, I haven't personally tested it, but the onboard microphone is quite terrible, and it is also quite close to the processor, which is noisy. And the combination of those 2 things account for about 95% of why AudioMoth is a suboptimal recorder. So by having an extension microphone, a microphone on an extension cable, you actually solve a lot of those issues. Yeah, sure, Nick, you should definitely give it a go, and do try to give feedback to the community somewhere. There's the bat corn analysis workshop Facebook group that's great for that. Is it true that AudioMoth records one huge file, single file, instead of separate calls? Not entirely sure what you're trying to ask, but what is true is, so you can set the duration of the file that you want to record, but it is not going to be actually triggered by a bat call. So it is going to record for as long as you tell it to, for example, 55 seconds, which is a very long file, because it won't stop after the bat has passed, if a bat has passed. Now, there are filters on board that you can use that will then remove all the blanks and remove whatever is not a bat, well, whatever is below or above a certain frequency that you set, meaning that you will have shorter files, easier to deal with, but it is never going to be as good as a proper trigger on something from Wildlife Acoustics, Elecon, Titley, which will start when the bat flies by and stop once the bat has gone, which means that most of your files should only have bats. You won't be recording loads of empty files. You would be recording bush crickets, but that's another issue.